Welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to our final global plenary session. We're going to be discussing with a fantastic panel tipping points and transitions to 2040. And I think, the context for this is that over the course of the last number of days, we've heard, there is going to be a diversity in energy systems. This will emerge and it will increase. And it's a diversity in terms of the people, the technologies, the geographies, the need for collaboration, the uses, and therefore there will be multiple transition pathways that are emerging. And what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to start with is to talk to us a little bit about their understanding. How would they characterize the diversity of the energy system to 2040? What would they highlight in terms of the change that we're likely to see? And also, I'm interested in the tipping point. Is 2021 the tipping point? Will COP26 be the tipping point? Or did the tipping point happen some time ago? Again, I'm sure each of the panelists will have maybe different views on that, and it will be very interesting to get that perspective. So I'd just like to quickly introduce my panel. We have Rafael Cayuela, who is the Chief Economist and Strategy Director at Dow Chemical. Rafael, welcome. Lovely to see you here. Gina Domanig is the Managing Partner of Emerald Technology Ventures. Gina, lovely to see you on the panel. Thank you for that. We have Paddy Padmanathan, who is the CEO of ACWA Power. Sorry, Paddy, I always mangle that. My apologies. And finally, we have Jeremy Bentham, who is the Shell Scenarios Leader. So again, a great panel. Very experienced, very experienced in the energy debate and energy systems understanding. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to follow the order that I was given here. So Rafael, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. How would you characterize the way in which energy systems are diversifying? What are the characteristics about that? And again, as I kind of threw in there, the tipping point. Has it happened? Is it happening? Or is it likely to happen in the future? Be interested to get your views on that.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, and for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to share some ideas on this very important topic. And let me start by recognizing that when I look into energy transitions and how this actually has been unfolding, as an economist, the first starting point, and this is perhaps the first difference versus previous transition points, is that when I go into my books and I look for energy transitions, they normally used to happen when something happened. And this triggering point was when new alternative energies, they were having a higher energy content and a lower cost. And of course, the second element was, as we move into this context, where is this energy giving the security to become secure to be used in a large scale? So if those were the two fundamental parameters of the starting point, those are going to change as we move forward, because what we start recognizing is that it's not only about energy content or energy efficiency versus cost. We are going to go through to some energies that in the short term might actually not comply with this first initial paradigm. What we start seeing is that we are internalizing basically negative externalities. So now is when we start adding the context of carbon, the context of greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, or even societal concerns as we move into other alternatives like nuclear, where maybe society is playing a role or concerns for society. So this is the first thing that I see different. The reason for the transition is changing. Second is the speed of the transition is different. When we did the last energy transitions, they took decades, even hundreds of years. This time is different because two fundamental reasons. First, in 9th of August, the UN declared a warning for society under the IPCC report. Humanity is under red code. So basically we have to accelerate, and this is the last decade, as we know very well, to really do this transition. So we don't have time to avoid the worst catastrophic scenarios. So the speed from a sustainability point of view is actually unprecedented, and it has to happen over the coming decades. The second reason why it's unprecedented is because in this decade, we will also have a tipping point, not only coming from climate, but we will have a digital point. Tipping point from digital is fundamentally, by 2029, the computational capacity of one computer will be equal to the computational capacity of one person. And that will accelerate basically what new technologies can start doing, from digital technologies on computational capacity, some quantum chemistry, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and so on. So the speed of the transition is faster. Third, the complexity on the business model would be also changing and challenged, because we will be moving from actually a kind of limited supply-driven demand, supply-driven energy system to an unlimited demand-driven system, where the whole business will start moving from the paradigm of basically limitation to unlimited. And the fourth one is, I think this transition is going to be very bumpy, and it's going to be full of tipping points. And it's difficult to recognize one particular tipping point. We're going to see tipping points from physical tipping points. On August 14th this year, we saw on the top of ice, on the top of the mountain of Greenland, that it was rain. This is the first time in 60 years. So what we are going to start seeing is that we don't know how physical risk will start impacting us in this transition, but they certainly will accelerate how things are happening. And this is going to happen from the transition risk, physical risk, but they're going to also happen from customer risk, market risk, financial risk. When are we going to start seeing stranded assets start taking a place? Or even more, monetary risk. You see now that climate change is not anymore a sideline discussion. It's actually entering into the whole economic model, because ultimately the whole transition is not an energy transition. This is basically an economic and societal transition. And this is why I think my final point here is that as we go into this transition, I think we have to recognize that probably the tipping points are going to be happening over the next decade. And in this regard, we don't have time, we don't have resources, and we don't have imagination or innovation to be wasted in this journey.
Rafael, thank you. A great setup, I think, in terms of setting out. Again, one of your key points there is that we talk about energy transition, but actually this is a much broader transition in the context of economic and societal as well. There isn't a tipping point, but there are multiple tipping points, TBD. As you know, who knows what they are likely to be, but we need to be aware of them, and they're likely to compress the way in which we think about transition over the next number of years. Great introduction. Thank you for that. Gina, can I come to you in terms of your own thoughts about this transition and tipping points?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to bring in the view maybe from the startup world and the venture capital world, and innovation, and working together with major corporations to make sure those innovations actually see the light of day. So to pick up on where Rafael left off, I mean, first of all, of course, I agree. The tipping points have already started. It was probably the first major one for us, being the sustainability focus. And we're hoping that obviously the technology innovation and business model innovation will provide additional tipping points in this transition. And if I just kind of pick up a couple of the points that we're most focused on or most interested in right now, kind of the reinventing the whole mobility model. And obviously the shift towards EV cars is great, but the whole EV charging infrastructure is still not solved in our point of view. It took a little while for people to figure out how much and where that charging would be taking place. Seeing now that 80% of charging is at home or destination charging, means only 20% is fast charging, but yet 90% of the financing needs to go into that fast charging. And we just still don't really see an economic model, because we don't see that the gas stations of the past, almost like the horse stables of the earlier mobility model, we don't see the gas stations of the future really to be having a clear vision, an economic model yet. So I think there's a lot of innovation that's going to go around that, not just technology innovation, but as I mentioned, business model innovation. And that's also partnerships with very large existing energy players as well. The second area is obviously the role of the individual in decentralization. They've gone from being consumers to prosumers, and now we're looking at them to be flexibility assets, if you like, so energy storage assets, enabling the whole vehicle to grid, not just on the consumer or the passenger vehicles, but also looking at medium heavy duty vehicles, which only 2% of the vehicles, but 40% of the energy storage. So we're investing in companies like Rhombus, who basically enable vehicle to grid using school buses, which is perfect because they're only used for a couple hours a day and they stick to a very clear schedule. So there's a lot of assets, a lot of decentralized assets that we need to bring in. And then to pick up on the point of digitization, right? This is what is going to enable the system to work. It's going to bring the efficiency to the system, flexibility, and the resilience that we need. So I would stop there. Maybe those are, let's say, the three big areas for us on the technology innovation side.
So Gina, just to focus a little bit on your comments, because we've talked, you've highlighted the mobility model, business model innovation associated with that. But is for you the transition, the major focus for you is electrification of the energy system? I mean, is that the orientation that you're taking your thinking? Obviously, there are transitions that are broader than that, but your comments focus, maybe naively, but seem to be focused on electrification.
Yeah, electrification. I would also mention green molecules, but I'm sure that Paddy's going to talk about them. So obviously, for us, electrification is a very big area of innovation. Hydrogen is also super important, a little bit less of a venture play because of the infrastructure investments required for that usually go beyond what the venture world gets involved in, but obviously very, very important area as well.
Okay, and just to, if you don't mind, just pushing a little bit. So, what have been the tipping points for you? I mean, as someone who invests in this, you will be excited about certain things because of a tipping point of a cost point coming down, an access point being increased, policy changing. What have those tipping points been for you in the context of this journey towards electrification and green molecules?
For us, we have to wait until policy actually starts to happen. So obviously there have been certain policy changes, consumer sentiment change, but even when we see very interesting technologies that theoretically could bring economic solutions to the market, if we don't see the incumbents actually embracing those technologies, it makes it a very risky investment from our point of view. So we're looking for policy changes and consumer sentiment, but we also need to have that third group. We need the incumbents, whether they be the oil companies, the utilities. We need them to start embracing certain technology innovations for that to become really an investable area from our point of view.
Because those incumbents reduce the risk profile of that technology. Is that how you see it?
And they have access to the end markets, right? It's I know everybody's going to prove me wrong with Tesla, but not every startup is Tesla, right?
Okay.
There are a lot of technologies that actually need the incumbents to bring those to adopt those technologies so that they actually have some commercial traction.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so thank you for that. That I think clarifies and sets out a pathway, that builds upon what Rafael said, but has a specific orientation to it, which I think is interesting. Paddy, if you don't mind coming over to you and your perspective on basically transition, diversity of that, and what you believe those tipping points are, have been, will be great to get your thoughts.
Yeah, look, coming at it from this kind of solution side, the tipping point from what we see is actually was 2018, 2019, that kind of time frame. And I'll just quickly explain that. And of course, it slowed down a little bit because of COVID, but the pathway is very, very clear. So what we see, and it's very, very clear, the world is going to become more electric, no question, for a very simple reason. We now know how to deliver electricity very cost competitively, pretty much a substantial part of the world, and most importantly, pretty much at a fixed cost. And that's an interesting subject to talk about today, as you see all the commodity prices kind of rocketing through the roof and, cycling up and down. So, I mean, we've been used to a world where energy cost was all over the place every week. And we are moving into a world where not only is electricity going to be it is the cheapest thing to do, to have, but also it is going to be a fixed cost, pretty much. Okay, so that's the future into which. So for me, and that trajectory is just moving. And so three pieces. One, moving more into electric. It doesn't matter where you are.
Right.
More efficient electric at that. And that electric is already low cost and will continue to become lower and lower cost and at a fixed price. So that's very significant. And even as we now move into thinking about industrial consumption, manufacturing, long distance transportation, most certainly hydrogen is emerging as it's early days, but I am very convinced from where we sit, as we have already gone into the first very large scale project, how quickly that cost can come down and will come down. But the fuel for that is also renewable energy stroke electricity.
Yep.
So it is all centered around electricity as we move forward. So, and the future system is going to be much, much more integrated. So you're going to have now, depending on where you are, a mixture of solutions. So everywhere you will have rooftop. Pretty much everywhere you will have some battery linked to that rooftop. Now, in many places you will have, for billions of people, it will be isolated. It's either on top of their roofs and just at their home, or little mini grids across the village or across some area. And then you're going to have big urban clusters, and you're going to have industrial clusters where it's all going to get linked. And with the smart grid integrated solutions, you're going to be able to trade with each other. So the prosumer concept. And then you're going to have very large central generation, which is still going to be needed in order to feed these clusters. And those central generation will be renewable energy based, and it'll be in the most optimum points, because we have learned how to transmit electricity over long distances. And we certainly know how to do that very cost competitively across very long distances across the land. And we will now move towards across the seas too, no question. And we will end up bringing the world with electron superhighways, and they will all be interconnected. And that interconnected grid systems will become much more resilient, and will require a lot less, because we will be using a lot less battery capacity or storage capacity, because we'll be using the grids effectively as the storage. We will be from where the demands are, across the time zones, across user patterns, all of that will make it much, much more intrinsically strong. So this is where we would head to. Look, with everything that happens these days so fast, simply because we've democratized not only the energy, the fuel, we have also democratized knowledge, access to information, innovation capacity. All of this, we have seen how rapidly renewable energy has transformed just in the last 5 years.
Yep.
That trajectory will continue. And within the next decade, I think in 10 years' time, this conversation, we will be sitting back and saying, what were we talking about in 2021? Wow, okay, well, you know what? Yeah, fine. It'll be a very different place.
So what you mentioned the tipping points of 2018-19. What were the tipping points that you would highlight that made all of this happen?
Very simple. For the first time, it was cheaper pretty much across a very significant part of the world to deliver electricity with renewable energy.
Okay, at a price point. Yeah, okay, fine.
At a price point,
yep.
You couldn't compete. And let me give you just one point of reference, a quick point of reference. Just to keep a gas turbine sitting there, just let it sit there, to put fuel in it and operate it, varies a lot. But let me just pick anywhere, and it sort of changes. 2.5 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour to put the fuel and to operate it. We were able to start delivering electricity at 2 cents and below across a very wide geography for that electricity when we were consuming. So forget about even the needs for battery. For that energy we consume at a cheaper price than the cost of putting the fuel in and operating.
Okay, no, I've got that. So I understand the point, which is that as a consequence of that, the tipping point of price competitiveness allows us now to think about the electrification of everything in a way we've talked about many, many years ago, but now we see that as some reality. Just a quick question to you, Paddy, if you don't mind.
That's what is also, hang on. That's what is also fueling green hydrogen.
Yep, absolutely. In certain parts of the world, when we have access to that. What about, how's this organized, Paddy? You know, we've talked about, everywhere generating, prosumers, tops of roofs, microgrids, urban clusters, central generators. Who organizes all of this within market?
Okay, so look, right now, private sector, individual consumers are just getting on with it, okay? Everywhere you see, I mean, look, in the United States, who are driving significant amount of renewable energy consumption? It's the Apples and the Googles of this world. So everywhere, it's private sector has jumped right in.
Right.
If you really want, but what is needed, what is desperately needed to accelerate this and to organize this a little bit better is for regulators and for governments to step in and embrace it and set the ambitions right. Look, the biggest issue around ambitions, by the way, is the biggest risk around ambition is not being ambitious enough.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Paddy. All right. So good linkages there. Again, from Rafael through to Gina on the electrification agenda, hydrogen agenda. Paddy, you're building on that in terms of, a tipping point in terms of price competitiveness and where that's changing. You also mentioned the electron superhighway. In terms of that emerging as a major change to the way in which we think about our systems as we go forward. Like to come back on that a little bit about NIMBYism, because obviously we've had in certain markets those ultra high voltage lines can happen. In other markets there's been a little bit of consumer pushback on that, so I'd be interested to get your points if we have time to come back on that at the end. Jeremy, if I can hand over to you, building on the comments that have been made, but also clearly with your experience from the Shell scenarios, I'd be very interested to see how you would characterize the transition and also the tipping points discussion that we seem to be having as well.
Well, thanks very, very much. And I've loved the conversation so far, so I think you'll see the links. But also I've loved the theme for this Congress, Energy for Better Lives, because it reminds me of a 2016 publication, Better Life with a Healthy Planet, that I championed. And that provided the technical backdrop to our later global scenarios, looking at the energy pathways over the century. And these scenarios, we call them waves, islands, and Sky 1.5, have both important similarities and significant diversity. Now, the similarities stem from the basic need for more energy services and cleaner energy services in the world. You can't do anything without energy, but emissions are diminishing quality of life. So we need to achieve net zero emissions as soon as possible in the next 30, 40 years globally. Now, the 5 similarities in all the outlooks driven by those deep economic and social needs are more efficient delivery of energy services, deep electrification of the economy, up from 20% currently to above 50% with renewable sources, the ongoing need for energy-dense, portable fluids, liquid and gaseous fuels, but increasingly decarbonized through biofuels and through hydrogen, as has been mentioned, or hydrogen-related carriers. The need to supply oil and gas whilst those decarbonized industries scale, and finally emissions removal, either by technical or natural means. Now, with those different trends that are locked in almost, the differences stem from different circumstances in different sectors of the economy, different technologies that are required in different sectors of the economy, different circumstances in different parts of the world, and crucially by different choices made by people. So the big difference in our scenarios is the speed of decarbonization. And it's really dependent on how different societies emphasize priorities in their recovery from the pandemic. Do they prioritize recovery in wealth, in public health, in security? And diversity in the nature and hence the speed of decarbonization becomes significant. We all know it took 2/3 of a century for oil to replace coal as the world's largest primary energy source. And oil has now been that source for over half a century already. Yet we have ambitions for wind and solar to develop from a small base and displace oil, gas, and coal in the next 30 years, requiring kind of the whole global economy to be rewired. Now, this is going to take and inspire, hopefully, game-changing innovation of 3 types. 1, technological, For example, durable, inexpensive fuel cells. 2, at the systems level, efficient combined water, waste, heat, power infrastructures, hydrogen infrastructures that have been mentioned. And thirdly, and significantly, social innovation. We see that it's the social and political side of things that really determines the pace of change over the longer term. And so we're looking at alignments within broad sectors of the economy, like aviation. You're seeing things like the Clean Skies for Tomorrow Coalition, marine, the Getting to Zero Coalition. You're beginning to see smart phasing of policy frameworks. You're beginning potentially to see innovative alignments between end-use customer areas and the web of supply activities behind that, like the tie-up between Volvo and SSAB on decarbonized steel. So if you're looking for tipping points, I would say, as others have said, all these areas are going to have their different tipping points at different moments. But watch out for breakthroughs in the decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sectors, like aviation, like heavy industry, like marine, etc. Look out for peak coal when that actually does happen in the world. Look at COP26 and the nature of agreeing Article 6, which can release the commercial engine internationally better than it has been released. And look for social developments that can take away some of the resistance to change that you see. So the just transition language that the European Union have adopted and embodied in their policy frameworks and thinking. I think these are the things to look out for, and look at how successful these become in the next few years.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. In terms of the global changes that you talked about, both at a technical level, systems level, and the social innovation level as well, and also some of the tipping points that you mentioned there. One of the key things that's obviously come through for everyone has been efficiency, deep electrification. You mentioned energy dense fluids, which goes to the hydrogen agenda, dealing with emissions in the context of oil and gas. First person really to deal with that. Rafael, can I come back to you in the context of your own organization? You have an emission footprint, et cetera, et cetera. How are you dealing with emissions, and what needs to happen for your organization as you go forward over the course of the next number of years?
Well, I think as any other heavy industry organization, like the petrochemical industry or the chemical industry, what we are actually focusing is, first of all, to understand the sense of urgency, where I think we are already interiorizing that. Actually, it was just yesterday that we just did our investor day, where we announced not only that we want to become net zero by 2050, but actually we just announced yesterday the first net zero petrochemical complex in the world that is going to be start to be operational in the next decade. So we are going to start delivering on this. So we are taking a very serious and conscious action, but as I think Jeremy was also mentioning, this is a journey, and Paddy. So it's a journey of basically availability of the different technologies, availability of the right political, technological, and regulatory framework, where, to be honest, still there are mismatches. And there are mismatches simply because, of course, this is something that is unfolding very fast, especially, and maybe that's another tipping point that we didn't discuss, has been unfolding, especially after COVID-19. I think COVID-19 has been probably another tipping point for acceleration on this regard. And what we are going to see is that we are going to start moving much faster, both as a company but also as an industry on this, and we are already doing that in our company.
So, one of my follow-ups was really on what's happened during the pandemic, and I say that only because I was at a conference recently, an energy conference that was talking digital AI, etc., and all of the providers. There was AWS, Siemens, other consulting companies were basically saying that the pandemic had really galvanized the energy industry and energy users in a way that was surprising. It's like 5 years of development, or at least acceptance of change, had been compressed into that 18 months. You seem to be saying the same thing. Is that right, Rafael, in terms of where that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at what is the impact of the COVID-19 in the whole energy system, but actually in the whole society, has been very profound. We have been seeing digital adoption accelerated in ways that we have not been seen before. So what it was supposed to be taking place in the time frame of the next 5 years took actually in the time frame of days or months in certain technologies. We have been seeing that. I think what COVID also has reminded us is actually that we do have technologies that they just need to have the right incentives, as we have been seeing for vaccination, and the right incentives in terms of subsidies, technology, and regulation, as we saw again with the sample of vaccines, how we can develop technologies that, again, they were already ready to be used, but we didn't have the need to do. So I think COVID is going to help us, has already helped us in the digital acceleration and adaptation, has been helping us on accelerating technologies. And I think it's going to also help us in understanding, going to the point from Jeremy before, that the realization that climate change as COVID-19 are global issues that cannot be solved individually. So now we have vaccines in developed parts of the market or the economy, but we know that until emerging markets and the whole society get through to this, we will not get fully ready from COVID. So I think it's pretty much the same for climate change and other global issues. Right. The question now is that there are positives, those are the positives, but there are also negatives. I think there are some negatives behind the COVID-19 that they are very important as well, that also goes into what Jeremy was saying on the social aspects. COVID-19 has actually reduced the level of fertility globally. Has also, when you look at what is the energy transition it's going to do from an economic point of view, we already know that we are at the peak of globalization. The peak of globalization under the current economic model is putting significant amount of pressure on the political system, where we have been seeing the rise of nationalisms and populisms. And that was before that we go through to a massive energy transition, where this is going to even put further pressure into basically globalization, but also the energy transition. So we're going to see further societal pressure to really go in opposite direction. And if that was before, now after COVID, where we also see that there are winners and losers, and we actually see that digital adoption is generating additional winners and losers. Because if we look at now, for instance, in the US, if you look at productivity gains through the cycle has been enormous. I mean, we are currently having the same level of economic growth in the US with 6% less of the 6% of the less of the workforce. So what it means is that I think in the context of a green transition that is inflationary, in the context of demographics and workforce developments that they are inflationary, and in the context of basically of peak globalization, we have to be very careful that actually we can handle this transition. And that goes to the point of social innovation and cohesiveness and inclusiveness on doing this, not only from an economic point of view, energy point of view, but also social point of view.
So there are, in summary then, there are some red flags associated with this. Yes, there have been some accelerators in the way you've talked about, but it highlights some social challenges and political challenges that we will need to navigate as we go forward over the next number of years. Gina, coming to your side of the equation in terms of where you're investing and what you think is important. Again, has the pandemic accelerated that for you? Or did it delay programs? Was investment starved for a period of time? Or are we seeing that all getting back to business as usual? Where are you in the cycle as of now?
I think on the startup side, there we didn't really see too much of a change in their activity or level of innovation, if you'd like. Where we saw, obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a major shift in priorities, and a lot of the very large corporations across the world first looking internally, trying to kind of deal with their own internal workforce. And I think that caused a small, let's say, delay. Then people reoriented, and I would say everything digital has accelerated, right? Every startup that we're looking at investing in, the acceptance from the very large corporations. They've been much more open to adopting digital solutions. The speed of adoption has been much quicker. I think also they have realized that they need to beef up their own internal competencies in the digital side. So I think all of that has been very positive. So I would say, the tragedies of the pandemic aside, from a technology, innovation and adoption side, I think it has actually had quite a positive.
And what about the notion, because as you said, the policy plays an important part, for you to look at new technology or look at new ventures. Is policy helping or hindering, do you think, at the moment? I mean, I'm saying that only because obviously where I sit at the moment, there's an awful lot of announcements all the time, which are good announcements, but are they actually, you actually have to decide where you put your money. I just read the newspapers and comment on it, but you actually do, your business model requires that policy to be moving in a direction. Are you optimistic about that, or are you exasperated by it?
No, I would say in most part, policy has had a very positive impact. We've got an incredible number of corporations announcing very ambitious goals, and then take a pause after the investor day and wonder how they're going to actually achieve them. And then they look for open innovation, which is fantastic, right? And then they're actually coming to people like us, asking us, have you seen companies with solutions that are going to help us to achieve these goals? So that has been very positive. The one area I would say where policy perhaps has had a negative effect is that those incumbents that are left with the stranded assets, they very often are finding themselves into financial difficulties, and they are exactly the ones that we need to have the means to actually adopt new technology solutions. So we have seen, unfortunately, those, and sometimes, utilities or energy companies have been very creative to split the company and put all the stranded assets into one legal entity and take the future into another legal entity. And those with the legacy, with the problems, are often financially not able to engage that much in innovation and adopting new technologies. So that is maybe one negative side that we've seen in the as a consequence of policy.
Okay, I'm going to link. Well, firstly, it's 1-800-GINA, Rafael, because it's a day after your investor announcement, so you need to connect there. And how the hell are you going to deliver against what you said yesterday? Anyway, that aside, let me link to legacy energy, if I can call it that, Gina, in terms of the oil and gas industry. And Jeremy, no surprise, I'm going to come to you. So in a number of the conferences that I participate in, there has been a consistent mantra of the last 6 months is we, the hydrocarbon industry, need to be part of the solution, not just being seen as the problem. And as we think about this transition that we've all talked about in a very eloquent terms and with a lot of detail and a lot of positivity in the context of electrification and basically the price of electricity, as Paddy highlighted, is now so cost competitive that we can envisage this transition to an electrified world and electrified superhighways. But there is this worry that the existing industry, i.e. hydrocarbon industry, is being left behind. It is part of the problem, and it's not actually being part of the solution. So I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that, but maybe I'll throw that out and get your perspectives on that.
Yeah, happy to reflect on that. And I think actually, if you look back at the history, a lot of the understanding of not only the capacity for transition, but the need for transition has come out of companies like our own. I mean, we introduced a film in the late 80s about climate change and concerns about that, and society wasn't ready for that then. And so we've had thought leadership positions, and in particular areas, we've had investment leadership positions. One of the things that is good for society that has happened in the last few years is that many others have caught up with that, and indeed in many areas gone ahead. One of the things to recognize, and I think Gina mentioned it earlier as well, is that a company like Shell, we actually, our long history is we were marketers and traders. We were marketers and traders of shells. And we adapted over time, and have been seen as an oil and gas company. But I still see us as largely an energy marketer and trader. We have far more delivery of energy services than we produce oil and gas. And so I think that there's a very important element of recognizing not only what you learn from that, but also the advantages that you have from that learning, and to apply those well. And something that I found helpful, so I'll share it with you, is the Stockdale paradox. Jim Stockdale was a survivor, a prisoner of war survivor from horrendous circumstances, and he was asked about what philosophy kept him alive when so many others weren't kept alive. And he said, well, one, you have to maintain an enthusiasm or an optimism that you're going to come through it. But secondly, you have to be brutally honest about the situation that you're in. And I think that brutal honesty is really, really important, that we don't get carried away by stories which are very positive, but about the easier things to do, and neglect the harder things to do, which is to develop the infrastructures, to make, for example, hydrogen happen. I used to be the chief executive of Shell Hydrogen.
Yeah, no, I saw that, yes.
I'm glad that it's coming through again, and I'm glad I kept it on our corporate agenda. But these things take time and investment and persistence to scale. And so let's be enthusiastic about the progress that's being made, but let's be brutally honest about what needs to be achieved, and who can kind of help achieve that at the scale that's required.
Okay, no, that's fair. But brutal honesty also means that, as Rafael says, we're running out of time when we think of a social agenda, et cetera, et cetera. But let me switch gears just a little bit, if you don't mind, to the panelists. I'd like to go to the question that was embedded in our session, which is customer-centric models are emerging. And Paddy, I'll go to you first, because I think you talked about the development of electric services, or maybe Gina mentioned the development of electric services. But if we're talking about the electrification of the energy system in the way and the depth and the breadth that you talked about, it will mean that the different services or different customer services emerge. I have to admit, I'm always a little bit confused by that. But as in your position, how do you see that model emerge? What are those new models that will change? And then I'd like to come back to maybe what are the implications therefore for existing business models of organizations to serve that as they go forward. But Paddy, over to you, if you don't mind, just some thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the simplest one to step into is the fact that you now have the ability to trade at a kind of individual household level. Systems are connected, rooftop. They are able to, when they've got surplus power, they're able to sell it back into the grid. So there are, in many systems, many countries, that model is available for people to exercise, and they are starting to. Then you are starting to see at remote locations, and there are some fantastic systems that originated in Bangladesh, but is now being propagated elsewhere, where at a rural level, individual house with a rooftop, some with batteries, some without batteries, now starting to get linked up in a very micro grid system using software in order to be able to trade electricity amongst themselves. Yeah. So you're starting, okay, now, and then in a very advanced economy, I mean, UK, Octopus Energy is an example, just to throw one name amongst many. People don't, just with an app and the ability to trade, they're able to, without even having energy systems, are able to optimize generation capacity and use, and trade that and plug people into the supply system. So you're starting to get a lot of different economic models and now think about what's going to happen with countries trading with each other between peak times and trough times. That's already been happening in the European grid, even in the Southern African power pool. A long time ago, they were trading electricity. Now, all of that is starting to get more and more and more electronics, electrical systems and software, artificial intelligence, predicting behavior and managing flows is all optimizing and continuing to make electricity more cost competitive and easy for people to access and easy for people to plug and play.
Right. And Gina, do you see, I mean, obviously, from where you are, you see the development. I think you actually talked about these new energy services emerging. What are they the same in terms of just being able to push your source of electrons back into the market, or what other models are emerging, particularly, let's say, in the EV market?
Yeah, I think it's actually making not just the residential consumer, but also I think commercial industrial players are very, very important, right? That they actually, instead of being the cause of instability, they're actually going to be part of the system to provide, a solution to the stability or the flexibility. So I agree completely with what Paddy said. So these digital technologies will allow that to happen seamlessly. People won't need to, become energy traders themselves. They'll just sign up for something that is, plug and play, super easy decision, and then voila, their assets are actually part of providing a solution. Also, going back to the EV, right? If we make it, it's not, it's not allowed everywhere, but in those areas where you're allowed to do vehicle to grid, again, that's a huge potential to provide storage of energy to the system. And again, looping in the commercial industrial guys as well, their fleets and whatnot. I think these are very different models, but I think, it's important that they are easy to use. It's important that the user interface is very simple. People have a commercial customer, they have a core business and they don't want to become energy traders overnight. There's a lot of, we just recently invested in an Austrian company called Inspired that, basically applying artificial intelligence to support intraday trading to help solve the balancing challenges. These types of technologies are emerging and what's important, they're getting adopted. And they're providing solutions to what a lot of people wanted to see as a problem. Going back to Jeremy's optimism, they're actually being seen as part of a solution to a temporary challenge.
And on that though, Gina, I'm only picking up on obviously the debate here in the UK on the gas domestic market, which obviously we've seen 10 energy companies collapse because regulation perhaps wasn't in place to ensure hedging had actually taken place to secure that the price cap could be met. And that's raised the question as we think about energy transition and we think about new energy models emerging, as you say, that allow that balancing to take place. Is regulation keeping pace with this, or does regulation need to come in to allow this to happen in the way that we would like?
Regulation is typically lagging, and there are organizations out there that invest a lot of effort, and I think it's needed to make sure that regulators are kept up to date on what is actually technically possible. So I think that a lot of education needs to go into the regulators themselves or into policymakers so that they understand what is possible and what they need to do to enable it and to not cause more damage perhaps in the process, right? So I do think that it is a challenge for the policymakers, but it is actually their role to be educated and to make the right decisions. So absolutely, policy can completely kill. The wrong policies can kill technology innovation and also the desire to invest in certain sectors overnight.
Okay, that's helpful. Actually linking on to policy, maybe Rafael, Angela has actually asked a question, it's come through on the WhatsApp. If the tipping points are now more social than technological, I don't know whether you would agree with that because you obviously mentioned a number of technological ones, do we need a new different approach to policy design Do you have any thoughts or comments on that, Rafael?
Absolutely, and I was actually, you could see my face as Gina was making the final comments. I think currently there is a major disconnect, indeed, from a policy versus technology and the current economic system. And the disconnect is very simple and very obvious when we start reflecting about that. Today, we are addressing long-term issues in a very short period of time with very disruptive technologies, with governments and politicians, with all respect, that sometimes are actually dealing with circumstances of a tenure of 3-4 years. You're basically putting assets that we need to invest for 40, 50 years or even longer when you have politicians that they have a time span, hopefully, as we have governments in Europe of like Angela Merkel, correct, with a scientific background, 16 years on tenure. So there is a disconnect today between the political reality and the regulatory reality and the technological needs and the sense of urgency. And I think building on what Gina was saying, I think the opportunity here and our recommendation, this is something we practice, is there is a huge opportunity and it's the need, actually, not an opportunity. Because again, if we don't have time, we don't have resources, we need to optimize what we have. And that basically means we need to step up as industries and leaders to self-educate in what is possible. And I do believe that there is much more available than actually what we think, but it's simply today not optimized in the way we probably corporations get optimized. Because when I look at regulatory regulations or financial incentives, often those are equally in silos. So we do have company silos, correct, and we have industry silos. Well, we do have policy silos, and both at the local level, regional level, national level, if we are in Europe, even European level, if you are even global, at global level. If we will work together in a new framework that actually help us to align these things, both from a regulatory point of view, taking into consideration not actually what is today, but the problems of basically the future, so a kind of longer term perspective, I think we could do much better. But this framework is still not existing. I think this is what I define often as a transition framework. I think this transition framework would be very critical to be able to.
And needs to be put in place with a matter of urgency in many markets. Yeah, I would agree with that. We've only got about 7 minutes or so left. I think we've had a rich discussion from each of you in the context of your own takes with regard to transition, your own takes with regard to tipping points. I think there's alignment around many of the directions, whether it's electrification, the tipping points of digital, or the tipping points of social and other technological changes that we see. Some of the challenges and barriers that we need to overcome. I would say one of the barriers is the role of the existing incumbents in hydrocarbons, as in we need to recognize they can contribute to this. As you talked about, Jeremy, there are real skills and expertise, and as incumbents, they also have deep pockets that can be leveraged in a way that can be very helpful. There are changes when we think about the new business models that are emerging because of electrification and other changes mean new services, new energy services can be created, which will bring in new players into the ecosystem. But to help that and to foster that, regulation needs to act as an accelerator rather than trying to catch up, which is often where we are today. And therefore, this is our final session, and I would like to put it to you is that what role would you suggest that the World Energy Council needs to play in terms of furthering this debate and discussion and taking the insight on transition and tipping points to the next level? Because again, Jeremy, to your point, I think your Stockdale paradox, we have to be brutally honest of the scale of change. And again, over the last 3 days, whether it's this conversation on hydrogen, emissions management, movement to electrification, etc., these are not overnight. These are not light switch moments. They are deeply embedded in legacy, transition, infrastructure, investment of trillions of dollars, etc., etc. So if we're going to be brutally honest and we continue to drive the agenda of better lives, humanizing energy, the overall theme for the World Energy Council, what role can the Council take as we go forward? And Rafael, I'll just go through the same order, start with you, then on to Gina, Paddy and Jeremy to finish off, and then we should be finished.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I think as you could see from my previous exposition and comments, I think the WEC has a fundamental role on doing that. We have an absence of this kind of this kind of organization to help together the whole story. This is not an energy transition. This is not an industry transition. This is a societal, energy, human transition. We will not be able to do this transition if we don't factor in all the social aspects, if we don't factor in all the aspects of what technology can do. And I would also call the attention that probably we don't even know today what some of these technologies could be doing. So when we think about the future of transportation, for me, we can ask around the table, the future of transportation might be very different with others think. I could actually think on cities owning cars and basically we're getting transportation for free. And the question would be, the technology is available, why not? We could have electrons as a service, we could have molecules as a service, we could have mobility as a service, everything as a service. The question is, if we don't have time, who is helping us, industry, society, and basically all the bodies that are part of all the stakeholders on this war, a war versus time, to collaborate and win that war and moving humanity from red into green. And I cannot imagine a better organization like the WEC or others that we don't have today to do something like that.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you for that. Gina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'll just build a bit on what Rafael is saying. I think the WEC is uniquely positioned, right? It's one of those few players where you're at kind of where technology innovation, you've got the incumbents, you've got policy, you've got the not just the pressures of society, but the needs of society, the demands of society, the wishes of society also. And I think that the WEC can actually help to build those models and to identify where the gaps are, whether they're innovation gaps, financing gaps, and help the players actually understand what role they can play to bring us forward, right? So I think that the WEC is I was referring to it before, but one of those unique organizations I think that has that role, and now it's needed more than ever, right?
I would absolutely agree. Absolutely. Paddy, to yourself.
Yeah, well, look, again, building upon that, so help us all to understand and recognize what is real and what is possible, and keep pushing us to be more inclusive and become super ambitious. It's about really, really engaging in dialogue and showing us and getting us all to recognize what is achievable. And there is a lot that's achievable.
Very good. Jeremy, finishing with you.
Yeah, thank you. WEC is a member-based family of organizations, a country-based family of organizations. And I think that there are three things that it can really kind of help achieve. First of all, within those individual countries, encouraging sectoral alignments, because the end user needs and the technological needs in each sector have their differences. Mm-hmm. So bringing that together and then engaging with the international sectoral organizations more effectively because of that domestic understanding. The second thing is encouraging within countries, within domestic political circles, an understanding of the domestic economic opportunities in transition. Yep. It's very much been framed as a cost, not an investment with benefits, including the ability to generate competitive domestic economic advantage. And I think that will be valuable because it will help accelerate changes in a more orderly way. And then thirdly, as part of that, when you have that kind of governmental and political attitude, you can begin to address better one of those points that Rafael made about political longevity, etc., which is encouraging the smart phasing of the different types of policies that you need at different stages in different sectors, whether that's encouraging initial technological innovation all the way through to spreading something economy-wide through carbon pricing, for example.
Right.
So I think those three areas of encouraging the sectoral alignments, encouraging understanding of the domestic economic opportunity, and encouraging smart phasing of policy.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to all the panelists. We're at the end of our hour. I think we've had a very rich discussion in the context of the energy transition, the way in which that's been interpreted by each of you. There have been absolutely some common themes, whether that's the electrification theme, whether it's the theme of technology, digital in terms of the way that's enabling us to think about energy systems as we go forward, whether that's the overall theme, as Rafael mentioned, which is we shouldn't limit ourselves to just energy transition. This is a societal transition that we need to understand, embrace, and energy obviously is an important part of the DNA of that change, but it needs to be viewed in that broader context. We've also heard about the new economic opportunities that this energy system enables. We often think about sources of supply in energy transition, but when we think about a societal transition, we are moving to a different economy, a different service base, and actually, as Jeremy just mentioned, there are opportunities for the World Energy Council to act as the platform that articulates that direction, that endpoint, and more importantly, how policy can benefit society as we transition from where we are today to a decarbonised future in the next 20 to 30 years. So to all of the panelists, thank you very, very much indeed for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed the last hour of our discussion. We'll play a short video now at the end, and then I'm going to be joined by Dr. Angela Wilkinson, and we'll have a little chat to summarise where we got to at the end of that discussion, and then we'll hand over to some of our closing remarks over the course of the next hour. Thank you very much indeed, panelists. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation.